Daft About Craft, the craft beer podcast.
Back in November last year, we had our first taste of Durham Brewery, when a series of their 10% Russian Imperial Stouts featured on Hype or Try. Owner and head brewer Elly was kind enough to send us those beers and also talk them through with us with a voice note. And now she joined us for a proper chat as we celebrate Durham's 30th birthday. Welcome to the podcast, Elly. How are you?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm well, thank you.
And you've been kind enough to send us a whole selection of beers. And one of the beers you sent us is your special 30th birthday beer. And that's the one which we're going to drink and talk about as we discuss Durham's history over 3 decades.
Sounds good.
You must have seen an awful lot of changes in the time you've been there, which hasn't been the whole 30 years, we should say.
No, I've been there just over 20. It was 2003. I joined the brewery. Wasn't planning on staying. I just thought, well, I'll go and help my mum out for a bit. My background's accountancy and art and design. Weird combination, but quite useful for the industry. And I didn't leave, basically. So I'm still here. Clung on long enough and eventually took on the full ownership of it. That happened in February 2020.
Was it because the beer bug bit you or you just couldn't escape?
Definitely the beer bug bit me. Yeah, I could have escaped if I wanted to. But I think the love for the business itself, for the industry and for beer, I can't imagine doing anything else now. And it's a really interesting area, basically. It's so diverse as well. So the great thing about beer is that there's a never-ending combination of ingredients that you can use, unlike wine, for example, which is, to me, a lot simpler. So beer can be more complex. You can put more of yourself into it, I think, as well, and create your own style. And like I say, there's new ingredients coming out all the time. There's new hop varieties coming out from the UK, never mind from anywhere else. Some brilliant new UK varieties of hops coming. And then there's the malt base, which is obviously pretty complex in itself, not to mention yeast. People forget how much effect the yeast has on the flavour of the beer. And that's an interesting one about this one, actually, the Sumerian, is that we've used a wheat beer yeast on this one. So it has got that sort of banana-y flavour about it.
So this, your 30th birthday release, which came out, when was it? July the 1st, was it?
Yes. Yeah, in bottle. It had launched before that in cask and keg. That was ready a little bit quicker. So we thought we'll let it out into the wide world and see what sort of response we get. And it's been extremely positive, which is always a relief. Well,
this is a honey and date wheat beer, 8.4%. And one of the things that we like about Durham is that even though you've been going for such a long time, always trying different things. And there's so many breweries of your sort of era that don't do lots of different things. They just do the same thing again and again. But you keep rewriting the rules.
I get bored. And I think Steve did as well, my stepfather. So it was my stepfather, Steve Gibbs, was the original founder and head brewer. And the bottled beer range actually began, so I'm going to open mine, because he was getting bored of the cask range. So he found the cask range was a little bit limited for his tastes. He's always liked the Belgian beers and the continental styles. And at that time, anyway, you couldn't an 8.4% beer, for example, in cask. And craft keg really wasn't around. Well, it just wasn't around at that time. So he started the bottle range, and it was really just a range to keep him interested in the brewing process and in trying new things and recreating historic recipes. He wasn't quite so keen to embrace the craft beer movement, I have to say. And something like a hazy IPA, well, beer should be clear in his mind, unless it was a wheat beer, in which case it's okay. And like the fruited sours and that sort of thing that we've done wouldn't have come from him. But I think taking over the brewery when I did, obviously meant that all cask beer brewing ceased. So it gave me a chance to find my feet and then re-emerge as something a little bit different. So it was strangely a positive thing for me anyway, for the brewery, I think, generally, because I think we had got a tiny bit stagnant before then. Steve was finding it stressful being in the industry. And yeah, it was sort of coming to a bit of a head, I think, for him. And this allowed us the break, really, it pulled everybody apart and it allowed you to put yourself back together again, maybe slightly differently, but with the same core values, the same principles and the same standards to work to, which has always been extremely high.
We've had breweries that either started in COVID or were just starting and found it incredibly difficult to get going, whereas you sort of saw it as an opportunity.
Yeah, I think, we were one of the first UK breweries to produce pale hoppy beers using American hops. And that might sound absolutely crazy now in our current market, because obviously those sorts of beers are everywhere now, but 30 years ago they weren't. And they certainly weren't in the northeast of England. But we found that the water that we've got here, we're really lucky. It's not been through the system too many times. It's just perfect for brewing with. And it really allows the aromatic hops that you might find from the States or New Zealand, generally speaking, allows them to shine through with a really nice, crisp, clean finish on it. And we actually found that we couldn't sell the pale hoppy beers in the northeast when we first started to produce them. This area wasn't actually ready for them at that time. It wanted brown, not stouts, not pale, just brown. And we found ourselves having to look a little bit further afield and sell into West Yorkshire and South Yorkshire, Sheffield, Bradford, Huddersfield, that's Leeds, that sort of area. So we've always had a really strong hold there. Roosters was obviously around at about the same time, and they were doing the same thing, Knaresborough sort of way. And then there were a few Sheffield-based breweries doing similar things as well. Obviously, the Northeast is more than caught up now with its beer scene, but that was how it was when we first started brewing. And we found beer has obviously gone through a lot of different fashions over the last 30 years. Magus, which is one of our original beers and probably our flagship beer, which is a 3.8% pale ale, also happens to be gluten-free now for anybody with any intolerances. If we were brewing that to exactly the same recipe as we were 30 years ago, it would be really boring. So in order to maintain consistency, we've actually had to tweak the recipes and to keep them current. But on the cask side of things, before I took over, we were really repeating ourselves a bit too regularly. And in the market as it is now, people are looking for new all the time. They want new. It's not so much about beer tickers, although I know there are still some about that like to make note and they only have a beer once. Never really understood that, to be honest. If you've enjoyed something, go and have it again. It's not so much that, it's that people are always looking for the new thing. Things move fast now. Everything moves quickly. So it's keeping people's interest by constantly producing something different. Often a variation on the theme with a similar malt base, but it's still experimenting with the new varieties of hops that are coming out. And I do get a little bit bored of using the same malt base, so I tend to fiddle a bit as well. Stick a bit of Vienna in or just alter something a little bit to add another dimension to it. The hardest bit about producing as many new beers as we do, because we've got a new pale ale coming out every 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. There's a new IPA, session IPA coming out again every 3 or 4 weeks. A new big hazy IPA every 6 to 8 weeks. A new stout has been coming out every 5 or 6 weeks. You've got to name them.
Do you do that?
Very easy. It's between myself and Diane usually. Diane's my sales lady. She started with the brewery February 2020 as well. And it's the first time we've ever actually taken on a salesperson. Before that, it was me trying to do everything. And that doesn't really work, to be honest.
That must have been a huge relief when you started taking on other people. Because I can imagine you were juggling all this stuff yourself.
Well, we had a brewer from, I think it would have been about 1997. And then Craig, our driver, who's still our driver, actually, our drayman, he started not long before me, about 6 months before I did. So he's been with us a long time. People don't tend to leave once they start. Now we've got Diane, we've got Craig, and we've got Will and Kelvin on production and brewing. Plus my brother-in-law has just started with us as well.
So what's that, 7 of you altogether?
6.
It's incredible, really. In my mind, I think, wow, there must be hundreds of people working up there, whizzing around, doing all these different jobs. But there's 6 of you, and you're creating new beers every couple of weeks.
But I think our size actually allows us to do that. When you get a little bit bigger, it puts restrictions because you've got commercial pressures and everything has to run a lot more tightly. There's a lot of, what's the word for it really? That there's no economy in monetary sense in producing new all the time, because you're having to buy a new lot of pump clips, you're having to buy a different batch of hops that you might not then use the remainder in something. So you've got a lot of expense producing a new beer. We don't do test brews. That might surprise you. We go full in, straight in it.
That's confidence, that is.
Or stupidity,
well.
One or the other. Part of Steve's retirement plan was, to keep him away from the brewery, because it was hard for him, was I got him a homebrew kit for his garage. It's actually more high-tech than our plant. It even has an app to control all sorts of things, which is brilliant. It'd be lovely if we could do that, but we can't. And the idea was that he would use that to do test brews for us. But we found that different plants don't brew in the same way. So it wasn't actually as much use as we we expected it to be. Scaling a recipe up, and even a different mash tun will produce, you'll get different sugars from it, more fermentable, less fermentable. Things won't finish where you think they're going to finish. So it actually almost caused more problems than it helped with, because you went into that brew with confidence it would finish here, and it didn't. It would stop up here somewhere or down there. So the other side of it is I needed to learn. So my background with the brewery was always the sales and marketing side of it and the accounts. I wasn't really involved in the recipe formulation. And when I first took the brewery on, we also employed a head brewer for a little while, and he left to go and work for a friend's brewery, and I didn't replace him, just went for it.
So you've learned all this stuff yourself, really?
I picked up more than I thought I had over the years. Brewing is, you're led to believe it's this sort of mysterious art form that you could never understand. And it is, but it's a bit like cooking. I look at formulating a recipe a bit like cooking, which I also enjoy doing. Once you understand your ingredients and how they're going to behave, and your equipment as well, what it's going to do, what it can do, what it can't do, then as I'm writing a beer recipe, I can almost picture what it's going to taste like. It can still throw me a curveball every now and again. But generally, if you do your research and you understand your ingredients, then it's not as complicated.
I can see Dave's mind ticking because Dave loves cooking, and I can see the cogs whirring, thinking, oh, maybe I should try brewing one day.
It's a very good analogy. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think you've covered in a lot of detail there, but both sides of what it's like in the industry as it is now. You have to keep releasing new beers. And on the one hand, it sounds like you like the challenge because you get bored. But on the other hand, it is, you're faced with having to think of something new every 3 weeks. So ultimately, do you enjoy having to do that? Or is it just would you rather have a smaller range which you can keep changing, or would you rather just have a constantly rotating range?
I think I like it how it is. I mean, I've made it how it is, to be honest with you, because I've got the best of both worlds as we are at the moment. I've got the bottled range tends to stay fairly fixed. It's not very often that something new comes out because it takes longer to produce and longer to sell, basically. So I've got the bottled range, and we've got our core beers as well. So we've got 3 core cask beers that I can be tweaking slightly and honing and crafting into something perfect. It's like a painting that you never quite finished, and you think, well, it could just do with, it could just, if I just, and you've got to know when to stop and leave it alone. We had a running joke in the brewery that for Steve, if anybody told him that was the best ever batch of Temptation that they were tasting, he would have to go back to the recipe and change it again. I think we're happy with it now.
Just talking about Steve, I've got to ask about this kit that he had, this small kit. Is he using it in coming up with all sorts of weird and wonderful different beers for himself?
Part of his retirement is he is writing a book on beer history. And that is really why we have this beer.
What a lovely segue. You could do our job as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was the very first beer brewed on his little kit as part of his book. So he started logically, because he's a very logical person, at the beginning. And this is the oldest recorded beer recipe in history, 1800 BC, I think it dates from roughly. The hymn to Ninkasi was written on a tablet of stone. Ninkasi was the Sumerian goddess of beer. And it's a sort of a rhyme and a chant that also describes the recipe, not in any great detail, I have to say. So if you had to use some artistic license with this. This Sumerian beer that we've got in front of us today began in 2018. So he'd already started thinking about writing the book back then. Okay. And he baked his unleavened bread as it should have been, with dates in and spices. And he used that to brew the very first Sumerian. And it was amazing. He brought it in. It was on keg on our bar in the brewery, and I said, yeah, that's lovely, but what do I call it? How do I market that? Because it doesn't fall into a beer category. So the salesperson, the market side of me said, I can't do this. How can I get the message across to people as to what this beer is about? It tastes like liquid banana bread, but I can't, that's not a beer style. So, and also there's no way that our plant could cope with chunks of bread. It would clog all sorts of bits up. So we had to think about a way around that. So there were about another 4 or 5 versions that he would keep bringing in from time to time as he tweaked and changed the recipe a little bit and made it suitable for us to brew on our kit. We did do a full brew worth in, I think it was about September 2020. And see, it shouldn't have any hops in. They didn't use hops. The problem with that is that hops are a quite important ingredient when it comes to the preserving of the beer. So the very first version that we did, we sent it off to Brew Lab for analysis, had a couple of little rods of bacteria in it, and there is no way that we could have kept that for more than 3 months. It would have started to develop some off flavours. So he kept one keg of it, and a little bit tearfully, we tipped the lot out. And for the next couple of months, he would come in and say, it's still tasting good, because he didn't agree with the decision to tip it out. And he'd say, it's still tasting good. Next week, still tasted good. In about 3 months, he stopped telling me it was tasting good. So I presume it probably wasn't. So I've taken his recipe. I have rebalanced the spices a little bit. It contains coriander seed, which is quite a common brewing adjunct, quite a historically common one. Cumin and cardamom.
Those spices really come through for me.
So I reduced the cardamom down a little bit because that's quite an overpowering spice if used unwisely, let's say. And I've added just enough hops to 15 IBU, which is just about the right alpha level to preserve the beer. And I also increased the ABV because it was 6% and I've made it 8.4 just to...
Do you like strong beers?
I like strong beer, yeah. I really enjoy brewing strong beers because the alcohol forms the backbone. It's what everything else rests on. So you can get a lot more flavour into a stronger beer than you can something lower in alcohol. And I don't really like to drink a large volume of beer, so a stronger one suits me. In fact, I generally don't really drink anything below 6%, but...
Well, I absolutely love this beer. I think it is awesome. There's so much going on in there, and it's so full and rounded. I love it.
I love wheat beers, and I can confidently say it tastes unlike any wheat beer I've ever had before. I don't even quite know, and I don't mean it in a bad way, I don't even quite know if for my taste buds I can even class it as a wheat beer.
It's like the wheat beer's there, and then it's got like a layer of spiciness on top of it for me.
I get probably a bit more of the sweetness of the honey, which is probably why I'm thinking it's more in the Belgian style of a double or a triple, because I get that on the top of it. But I do get a bit of spice as well. But I've never had a wheat beer as complex. And it doesn't taste of 8.4 either. It tastes strong. I know it's well above 5, for example, but it doesn't necessarily taste 8.4.
That's what we're really good at.
Hiding it well.
We found that with those, with the stouts last year. They were incredible for the ABV. It was so well hidden. And not in a, with hidden bit by lactose, for example. It was very, very drinkable. And this is the same.
This does contain some lactose.
Really? Does it? I'd never have guessed.
Just a little bit, because... honey is obviously a really simple sugar. So whenever you make a beer with honey, it actually ends up very, very dry because this is in the mind of Elly how brewing works. I imagine he used to be like little Pac-Man going, nom, 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 all through the sugar, nom, 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 nom. And it's finding it really easy to use that sugar in the honey. So you'll end up with a drier beer rather than a sweeter one. I found the same with fruit beer. So if you're using fruit puree or fruit concentrate in a beer, that fructose and that sugar is a very simple one for the yeast to actually convert into alcohol, meaning you end up with a drier beer at the end.
Is that why sometimes, because I've had this before, but I found with sours sometimes get that sort of biscuity taste at the end. And I always thought that was just my palate. But is that because that's how mine reacts to it, because it's broken it down and made it drier?
It could be more that the sugar is there still, but because it's sour, you have to wait for the sourness to go off, and then that's still lingering on your palate maybe. But we found we need to add lactose in if we want fruit to come through in a beer, or if we want something like honey to come through, because you lose the flavour by not having the sweetness there. So it's a necessary quantity of lactose is in here. Because we've also got quite a large quantity of date syrup, and that adds an extra level of complexity, I think, to the sugary. It's that sort of candied sugar almost that you get in a Belgian beer.
Makes any sense at all? When I think of that sort of sugary taste, when I think of the Belgian doubles and the triples, it's a light colour in my head. This is a darker colour. Does that make sense?
There's a lot going on, and you can see why I held off producing it at full scale again, because I really didn't know what I was going to call it. And even now, I would agree with you. Honey and date wheat beer, it doesn't really do it justice.
It's its own style, isn't it? Which I guess makes sense. If it is a beer that is, the oldest recipe going, it didn't have a style to be put into because it started it all.
And I guess it is quite an apt beer for your 30th birthday, because it's just another example of you doing what you want to do, doing it your way.
Well, I just thought if we can't brew this for our 30th anniversary,
Yeah.
when can
When
we brew
can
it?
you?
Because it's an anniversary beer, that will get it over the line for people. And then once they've tried it, they'll
Yeah.
love it and
Yeah.
they'll go back for another.
Yeah.
Does it taste different again on cask as well?
It's slightly less carbonated because in a bottle, you're always going to get sharper, spikier bubbles. So it's a little bit smoother, a little bit fuller and rounder as well, probably, because it tends to mature more quickly in a bigger container. No idea why that is. There's no scientific reason. This is why we found that the barrel aging, I mean, it helps obviously that the wood is porous, but I'm skipping now to another beer. But when I'm talking about Imperious or the Beads barrel that we've just launched, that is like the original beer, but aged maybe 2 or 3 years, as opposed to the 6 months or so that it's spent in the barrel. It does the job much more quickly, but I'm not sure why. That's just one of the lovely things about beer. And for all that I was worried that I didn't know enough, I'm now quite happy not to know it all. It's fine. It's okay, because nobody does. And the more brewers you speak to, the more you realise that it can still throw a little, you thought you knew that, but I'm not going to do that this time. So
I think most brewers probably do things their own way, which is different to somebody else's way, but you end up with more or less the same thing at the end, but you go through a different process to get there.
I think everybody's got different equipment as well.
Yeah.
So ours is quite at the heart of it. It's quite traditional. It's built for cask, really, with an oversized mash tun. So we're a 10 barrel plant, but we've got a mash tun that will fit 20 barrels worth of wort in it in order to get 10 barrels worth of extract for temptation. So really the whole plant's built around temptation, basically. But
if anybody listening to this now hasn't tried your temptation, they need to get onto your website and try it, because it is amazing.
Definitely. You mentioned that our beer range doesn't contain too many bitters, but this is the year of the bitter.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
All of a sudden.
It's coming back round again. It doesn't have to be boring, so you can still produce a really interesting bitter. We've got a lovely one called Bohemian.
This is the thing. In my mind, going back years when I was a kid, your dad would have a bitter and it looked terrible. He'd have a mild. It looked terrible. It smelt terrible.
Whoa.
Well, that's just my opinion. But you can do so much more with them. And we've had some great examples that we've tried on this podcast, Dave, where they're so much better than what I saw as a kid. So what my dad was drinking, there is so much more you can do with them if you put a modern twist on them.
I think you can with the mild. I mean, I'm interested to see with bitters, because I don't mind a bitter, but I would subscribe to the school of thought that there are bitters and best bitters, and I haven't seen the modern twists on them yet. But as you say, they're coming, aren't they?
The beauty of a really good bitter is it tastes really simple. A bit like a really good lager. There's something almost luminous about it in its perfection and its absolute balance between the malt and the hops. It's far more difficult to produce a good bitter or a good lager than it is to produce an IPA.
Yes, that seems to be coming through more and more now. You talk to brewers and it's just like everyone can chop hops together to make a hazy pale, but there's no good lager.
Presumably there's no hiding place with your lagers and your bitters.
No, nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
It's all bare and out there. And if you've got your balance wrong in one way or another, it's very prominent because it's such a subtle beer in the first place. We've actually also just launched a Dunkel. Got a dark lager out at the moment.
Look at his eyes light up. He loves a Dunkel.
My love of beer came from sort of when I started drinking different things. The German beers were obviously around and the Belgian beers were around because of their history goes back centuries. So when I found different beers, those were the first ones I found. So I love all those styles. But they are now being matched. You touched upon it. You're doing a triple and you've got other beers that are very similar and have that sort of heritage within your range. Obviously, we touched on bitters there, but, this is a wheat beer, triples, Dunkels. You take your inspiration from everywhere, I guess.
Yeah, why not? And sometimes I mash styles together. Then I call it a fusion because I don't know what to call it. Beer descriptors are becoming a little bit more fluid, aren't they? Sometimes I'll write a beer recipe and actually then try and work out what category it fits into. So I haven't been to college to learn how to brew or university. I've learnt it through being in the brewery. I've also not maybe had as much experience of drinking other beers as some of the brewers maybe. I really like my beers. There are other breweries that I will, if I see them, I'll be like, right, I'm having one of those.
Go on, tell us who. Tell us who. That's what the listeners are thinking.
You put me on the spot now. What if I miss somebody? I'll tell you who I've been wanting to try for a while, Wishbone Brewery.
Okay.
I hear some nice things. Marble, always quite like their beers. Trying to think who else now.
Sorry.
It's all right. Years ago, I would have gone for Tempest, but I haven't tried their beers recently. But yeah, there's certain breweries that I think, well, that's likely to be good quality. I'll try one of them. And it depends where I am as well. So if it's a decent pub, I'm far more likely to drink a beer, one that I'm slightly iffy about.
Mm.
I'm a beer snob. I'm really picky, and I can't help but analyse beer. So if I'm out having a drink, I become a really boring person if I'm sat having the beer, because I'll be a bit of diacetyl in that.
Yeah.
It's not quite ready yet.
Do you sometimes wish you could go back to a stage where you weren't that person and you could just sit down in a pub and enjoy a drink?
Yeah, and it actually disrupts their thinking, and they can't concentrate on any conversation at the same time. And I think it's the same with, if you're really into whatever you're doing, work-wise or even hobby-wise, once it's ingrained in your mind, you can't sort of undo it. So there's no point in wishing I could go I could go back again, because I can't.
No, as someone who is also deeply analytical, I 100% get what you mean by that. Just with your recipes, out of interest, do you have to sit down and think, right, so I need to, the next beer we probably should do should be, I don't know, 6-7% range, this style? Or do you just wake up one day and think, you might be making a cup of coffee or putting the shopping away and think, oh, you know what I'd like to make? Like, what is your process quite sort of, I've got to sit down and do it? Or
funnily enough, I was asked that earlier by my brother-in-law. He said, how do you go about writing a recipe? Because I was sat there writing one. So there's a number of different approaches. Sometimes I'll have had a discussion with Diane. We work very closely together. She has to sell it. So it has to be what she wants to sell, basically. That's why it works. So I'll say, what do you want next? I think we need something like this. And she'll go, that usually means, no, I don't agree with you. We'll get to a point where we'll agree a bake style, a colour, and an ABV. And then I go off and do what I want with that brief. Sometimes there's just a beer that I really want to make, and then she just has to deal with it because it's happened. The Dunkel was one that I don't think she particularly wanted, but it's actually selling really nicely. So that's a relief to everybody.
Do you ever find yourself out and you try a beer and you think, I can do better than this, and then try to replicate that beer but make it better? That must happen.
Not very often.
Oh, really? Okay.
So I'm aware of what's happening in the market, but more from a reading rather than a tasting point of view. I've got 2 kids and I don't get out much, in a nutshell. I'm at work and then I get home, and next lot of work starts at home, and and then it goes round like that. So I do get a bit like a kid in a sweet factory if I get into a bottle shop, and then I will spend too much money. Then I'll probably forget about drinking it. Yeah. I've got some lovely Torside Dogs of War bottles over there behind me. Nice. So I got 5 of them sat behind me somewhere, and actually there was one of theirs that their smoky stuff's really amazing. We've obviously got Smoking Blonde, which uses the oak smoked wheat from Weiermann in Bamberg. They are much more experimental with the types of smoked barley that they use. I think we've just recently done a collaboration with them. Tom's Tap's the other one, so Sean Ailing, we went and did both of them. They're really interesting, and definitely they did a Storlat. It's 2.8% and it tasted amazing. I think it was a Polish style, absolutely stunning for such a low ABV. Because I wouldn't normally be heading in that direction, but the smokiness kept your interest all the way through. So that was lovely. But generally, I'm doing my own thing whilst taking a cue from what I'm hearing out in the market. And it is sort of giving me ideas, or a new hop variety might come out, and I think, how would that be best used from its description? But I've only got its description. You get tasting notes with your hops, basically, and you hope that they're accurate. One amazing hop, I think, was it last year it came out, as Nectaron. Absolutely stunning. I think my favourite.
Big fans of Nectaron here, yeah.
Yes, Phantom's N is for Nectaron in their single hop series is one of my favourite beers. Brilliant to find this. Sort of breweries like yourselves that are just completely confounding what you might sort of idly think of, and then when they actually have a proper look.
I mean, the range that we've got at the moment is absolutely bonkers.
It's so diverse.
Yeah, it really is. And I give Diane the list that she's got to sell off, and I'm thinking, well, if you can't sell, if you can't find something in that lot that's going to suit somebody. But yeah, the Nectaron, that's actually the second time we've brewed that. It was brewed first about a year and a half ago. I think we did that one.
What about you, Dave? I find Elly's take on everything quite refreshing and not something we come across that often.
No, not really. It's quite something to get my head around, really. suppose actually a good question is, been up north and I've been drinking. I know there's a very good craft scene in Yorkshire and in the northeast again, but I'm still surprised that your stuff is doing so well that you can do festivals and you can produce these beers and they sell them. I don't mean that nastily,
No,
but
you've got Hadrian and Border up the road as well, and they just turned 30. Massive festival, still massively popular.
Is your audience kind of younger or older people, or does it straddle all generations?
Straddles both.
I guess it would with the styles that you're doing, yeah.
We try to please everybody. So the way to stay in business is to have something for everybody, in a nutshell. And we don't want to upset our older customer base who used to certain beers, and they come in for that specific beer. And if it's not there, they will just walk out again.
Yeah.
So another interesting thing that happened in COVID, sorry to keep going back to that, but it really was quite a time. Because the pubs were shut, you had to go and buy your beer from either direct from the brewery or the supermarket, and you were drinking at home. And you were drinking at home without your friends. So there was no peer pressure. There was no judgment on what styles you were picking up. And nobody was watching you pour it down the sink if you didn't like it. You know, that embarrassing moment when you've picked something at the pub, you have a few sips and you think, you know what, I can't finish this. I'm going to have to take it back. That's really terrible. I feel awful about it. So people were trying more variety. They weren't sticking to what they would normally stick to in the pub, for example.
Yeah.
And whether it's the older generation of drinkers, the middle-aged or the younger ones, they all came out with a much more diverse palette than when they went in.
Had you got an actual bestseller during COVID? Can you pinpoint it down to what sold best?
Yeah, it was Magus, because it's 3.8% and pale.
Right.
And because it's been around, so most of our bottle range is only available in bottle, whereas Magus and the Dark Angel actually as well, the stout, those two are available in cask and in keg.
Right,
and you saw the sales of like the mini. People would buy the minis and set up shop at home essentially.
Pretty much, yeah. We were lucky though; we had the online shop already up and functioning, so we weren't scrambling to make that work. Courier is already sorted, and from feeling my stomach kind of drop through, thinking what we're going to do, it suddenly took off.
Dave and I have talked about it at length, not necessarily on the podcast, but I don't think you and I probably ever bought as much beer as we did in COVID, did we?
I mean, we went nuts in COVID.
Was the thing, because you couldn't spend your money on anything. Well, of course you could spend your money on other things.
Well, we didn't. But on some occasions, I'd have 3 or 4 deliveries a day from different breweries. It was insane. Yeah. Goodness only knows what the delivery people used to think. But we're not alone. A lot of people are like that. It was their time to experiment and try different things.
Yeah, and that's only a good thing, isn't it, really?
Oh, yeah.
But it meant that customer base that we did have ready to try the new things that I wanted to make. And then that enables us to get the younger customer base excited about what we were doing as well, because we were doing the right sort of beer styles for them. We've just brewed a pina colada milkshake IPA.
Oh my God, I never thought you were going to say that. Wow.
Yeah. I didn't think I would ever say that either. But we have loads of pineapple puree. We still like to do it properly. A lot of conversations about use of flavourings in beer and whether you should or shouldn't. The problem is if you don't, people complain.
Yeah, people like me will complain as well, because if you tell me it's going to taste of something like that and it doesn't, but then I get... Not annoyed, but it's just like, well...
you do get annoyed. But on the flip...
Yeah, no, I do get annoyed.
But on the flip side of that, if you go in too heavy-handed and then it tastes sort of synthetic and artificial, you'd also get grief.
Really nasty flavourings out there.
Yeah.
Especially the fruit ones can taste very much chemically in pear drops. And so it's...
Yes, it's a balancing act for sure.
Something else we've got to talk about, and it's a weird subject to bring up really, is women in beer, because... people make a lot of song and dance about women in beer. And I almost feel bad for bringing up the subject of women in beer, because it's quite obvious you're very articulate. You know what you're talking about. And the fact that you happen to be a woman is kind of irrelevant to my way of thinking. Have you faced prejudice in this industry for being a woman?
Not probably from where you might expect it to come from, though. So back in the day when I could be bothered to do market stalls, but I really don't like standing and smiling at people all day, so I'm not very good at it. And your face hurts at the end of it as well, so I don't do them anymore. But when I have done them in the past, so I think there was a few in sort of 2020, 2021 that we did, because they could be outside, so they were great, weren't they? I found that if I had a male member of staff with me, and they were usually sat behind somewhere, not really interested in what was going on, I was at the front doing that because I love talking about beer, as you can tell. And it was both, but mainly women actually, of a certain age, saying, "Did you actually drink beer yourself then?" And I said, "Well, it would be a rubbish job if I didn't."
I bet you absolutely revelled in telling them it was your business and you make the beer.
Yeah, well, it just, why would I be stood there if I didn't drink it?
Mm-hmm.
It was just a silly thing to ask. And they'd be asking questions about the beer. I would be answering them, but they'd be looking at the man behind me. And that was annoying. I've also had a couple of sales reps incidents where they've come into the brewery and I've been stood talking to a male customer and they've walked straight past me as I've stepped forward to greet them and talk to the man. Obviously, they didn't make a sale that day.
If listeners could see us, sort of me and David just sitting here shaking our heads thinking, surely people should do their research and realise who you even are before they turn up at your place anyway.
Yeah, I've even had it at the SEBA convention.
No way, really?
Yeah. So I was stood at the Charles Fairham stand. This is not a knock on Charles Fairham, actually, by the way, before we get into it. I don't know who it was that did this. Stood sniffing hops and doing the rub and everything.
Yeah.
Had my Durham Brewery jumper on or whatever. A random man stood next to me. I was there on my own because I couldn't afford to let any of my staff come because they were busy working for me. And random man stood next to me with no livery on him. So he was unbranded. And someone from the stand behind looked round at the front of us and said to him, "Durham Brewery?" And he went, "No." I said, "No, he's not, but I am."
That must really irk.
Yeah, that's a bit annoying. But other than that, I've not really thought about it or been that aware of it because obviously most of my team are men. I hope that they respect me. They maybe don't always. But we are in an industry that is dominated by men. But actually in the Northeast, there's quite a lot of breweries that are run by women.
Yeah. And a lot of women drink beer as well.
We've sort of found doing the podcast as well, like a lot of the breweries people would think are husband and wife teams. You know, I was just the example you were giving there, and I was thinking in my head, I bet if Burnt Mill went to a stand and put Sophie Durand on serving the beer, people, that's probably generalisation, but people wouldn't go, "Oh, you brew the beer as well." Like there'd be a lot of just, "Oh yeah, you selling the beer." You know, there is still a lot of.
They think I'm the receptionist, which is fine sometimes because sometimes I can't be bothered to deal with them. So yeah, sorry, the boss isn't here right now. See you later, bye. Sometimes I'm the cleaner. Oh no.
Yeah, you're sort of hiding in a
cleaner.
I'm sort of aware that we see a lot of stuff on social media about women in beer and how women should be treated this way and that way. But it's really important to say this doesn't just happen in beer, it happens in every walk of life. It happens
everywhere. I think it's got to start from women having a bit more respect for themselves in the first place. And that's maybe a little bit of a controversial thing to say. But I do the brewery tours and I have a group of people who don't know who I am, most of them. Some of them are repeat customers that just love coming for them, but a lot of them don't know who I am. And I always feel a prickle of anxiety as I stand up and say, "Hi, my name's Elly and I'm the owner and head brewer of Durham Brewery." And I look out for the ones that are kind of, oh, really?
And does that happen
then
a lot?
Ignore that. No, a little bit. Sometimes I get a little tingle and a prickle of something that, that's a bit unusual. But by the time I finish talking to them for 2 hours...
Yeah, you've changed their mind.
Yeah, and I don't have to have an ego either. Often the feedback I get at the end of a brewery tour is that it was a really refreshing, very honest, because they get a little window into my weird personality as well, which doesn't get covered up or masked, or I'm easily distracted. Sometimes I've gone, there's a squirrel halfway through a brewery tour. That's the beauty of being a woman. So there's advantages too, is that I don't have to be strong and certain and always right. I can be wrong and that's okay. Cheers magazine up in the Northeast, Alistair Gilmore's magazine. He wanted to do a piece on women in beer in the Northeast and I refused. And I refused because why wasn't he writing a piece on people in beer?
Yeah, 100%.
And I would be happy to be included in that.
Yeah.
So I haven't really, as much as I do support more women being included and feeling included in, and not any discrimination, whether it's positive or negative, is still discrimination.
I think when you're brewing a beer that is just brewed by women and you make a big song and dance about it, it's almost self-defeating because you've had to make a song and dance about it being brewed by women.
Yeah.
It should just be a beer that has been brewed by a bunch of people who enjoy beer. For me, their sex is irrelevant. The minute you draw attention to it, you've made it an issue.
Yeah. But then I do want to support that movement as well because I'm a woman in beer. So I want to support it. But on the other hand, I just, any discrimination to me is not helpful because it shouldn't need to be said. And after you talk to a group of people for a certain amount of time, they're not looking at you as a woman in beer that's an unusual creature anymore. They're looking at somebody, hopefully, that knows what they're talking about and has impressed them with the beers that have been brought out and is genuinely enthusiastic and about the industry and about what they're producing. I just carry on bulldozing through, basically, and ignoring it and really pretty much being oblivious to it, apart from when it's really right in my face. That's the best way.
I think you're probably dealing with it the right way. Just crack on and it's hard to change the opinions of certain people, isn't it? Even though you might want to. You're never going to do that.
Yeah, and I think that goes for any kind of discrimination.
Yeah.
I mean, it is mainly white men who are.
That is what it is, isn't it?
But it'll change. It will. But it's got to be that women want to work in the industry as well, because it's all that I don't think the barriers are there to stop women from working in the industry. That's the big thing. They don't want to. If they did want to, then they would.
And during your time at Durham, have you seen more and more women come into the industry?
Yeah, definitely. Often as a husband and wife team starting a brewery. But then we've got First and Last Brewery up on the borders, and Red is definitely in charge of that one. She's the head brewer, and she's a very good brewer. So it's changing, which is good, definitely. And let's hope it continues.
That's a really enlightening conversation.
No, the whole thing has been.
Well, look, Elly, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was a really interesting look, and your approach is probably quite like no other that we've experienced on the podcast. Now, I love that. It's really refreshing. But now, if people want to get hold of your beers, the 30th beer that we've drunk tonight and anything else, where do they need to go to?
Well, first stop's the local bottle shop. We do supply quite a few around the Sheffield, the North East, Bradford area and into Lancashire. If you can't find a bottle shop stocking it, tell them they need to stock it. And then beyond that, we have a website, so durhambrewery.com, and free delivery on orders over £45 to UK mainland. Fast delivery as well, usually within a couple of days of ordering. But support your locals first.
Get in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram at Daftaboutcraft1.